Welcome to Proving the Point, where we discuss important research papers that you should know about. Today, we're going to talk about this paper called African Marriage Systems, Perspectives from Evolutionary Ecology. And so what this paper discusses is basically the family structure of native tribes in Africa. And the term marriage that they use, it's not marriage as we would understand it, between like one man and one woman. Rather, the family structure in Africa, typically a man will have multiple different women that he has children with. And likewise, the women, they often have sex with multiple different men, such that the paternity of her children is often not even known. And another interesting feature of the African family is that they have very little investment by the parents in the offspring. So even the women, they're not the primary caregivers for their children after about a year old. They basically foster them off to the elderly or to other children to do most of the child rearing, while all the people in reproductive age are off basically trying to produce as many children as possible. So this reproductive system, it's one of high fertility, low parental investment. And what that does is it produces a lot of people quickly, but the quality of the people it produces is not great because they're not being reared very well. And so you end up with highly dysfunctional societies. Okay? And then they talk about why that might be the case in Africa specifically, based on the environmental factors and evolutionary ecology. So the reason this paper matters is because, of course, Europe and North America, basically every European society is now importing African refugees and migrants into our societies en masse. And so we need to understand the evolutionary history of these people and what they might bring into our societies. One thing they might bring into our societies, and there's already plenty of evidence of this, is a dysfunctional family system. It's one of high polygamy, high promiscuity, and basically low care for children. We already see that in countries where, like in America, for example, the out-of-wedlock birth rate for Africans is like upper 60%, high 60% of children who are black are born, out of wedlock. So that's probably in part a consequence of Africans' evolved mating style, and it has a lot of negative consequences for our society. So this is part of a broader argument of we don't want these people to be brought into our countries. They're biologically different than us, and some of those differences will harm our society if we allow it to live here. Okay, so it's an anti-immigration argument from Africa specifically. Okay. So as we go through the paper, you should think about like the African American population or the African population in Europe, and understand that a lot of what we're about to talk about for Africans in Africa, it still carries over into these new areas where Africans go. And a lot of these things are harmful. Again, lack of care for the children, hyper-promiscuity, things like that. All right, so let's get into the paper. So she starts off by saying that a problem in Africa is that the birth rate is extremely high, despite the fact that there are several factors, like, for example, education is increasing, child mortality is decreasing. So despite several factors like that are supposed to lower fertility rate, as they have everywhere else in the world, the birth rate remains very high in Africa. So they evidently have some sort of unique reproductive strategy that's not responding the same way as other populations. Okay, so they say, in much of Africa, there persists high fertility and a pattern of parental investment in which both mothers and fathers invest, by Western standards, relatively little in each offspring and pursue a pattern of delegated parental responsibility. So we'll talk about that more in a minute, but delegated parental responsibility, like I said, they're basically pawning off their children to the elderly or to other children and have those people take care of them. They say, coupled with low investment parenting is a mating pattern that permits early sexual activity, loose economic and emotional ties between spouses, and in many cases the expectation on the part of both spouses that marriage will end in divorce or separation. Okay, followed by the formation of another union. So basically what they're saying is the parents, they basically go into their relationship knowing that they're not going to invest in their children, knowing that their sexual activity is temporary, knowing that they're not going to form strong emotional ties with their partner, and knowing that they're basically going to separate and then find someone else. So again, you can apply that to African populations in other areas besides Africa, like America, for example. They're extremely promiscuous. They're always looking for the next sexual partner. They're not the type to settle down and have just one partner. And again, that brings a lot of issues for society. It worsens people's trust in each other. It lowers cooperativity. There's all kinds of problems associated with promiscuity. Okay? But Africans, they have a reproductive style that features promiscuity very heavily. Again, they say there's common practice in which the rearing of children is shared by many kindred of a child, and in which the biological parents are not the primary caretaker. That's called fostering off or lending your children. So that'll come up more later on. The reason they do this is, as they say here, basically women foster out their children from a previous mating in order to remain attractive for future sexual partners. Okay, so in other words, no man wants to have children with a woman who already has a bunch of children, because then his child will be competing for those limited maternal resources like love, effort, energy, food, with the other children that the woman already has. In other words, the woman has 5 children already, and you get her pregnant. Well, now she has 6 children, but your specific child is only going to get 1/6 of the mother's attention, love, food, etc. And so it's not going to get high quality rearing from the mother and is therefore less likely to thrive. So basically, by pawning off her existing children onto relatives or grandparents or so on, the woman can appear child-free and therefore attract other sexual partners and therefore have more children. Okay? They say that's the rule rather than the exception in some parts of Africa. They say it's common for the child to spend only a limited time residing with either or both biological parents. Okay, so again, imagine what this does to the child. They're basically getting passed around to people who are not that close to them and don't care that much about them. Their development is going to suffer extensively. So this is, in terms of quality of offspring, this is definitely an inferior reproductive strategy. It's all about prioritizing the quantity over the quality in the case of Africans. All right, so in this paper, she attempts to understand why Africans have this reproductive style. We'll talk more about it later, but she basically says that she thinks it's because they perceive there to be an abundance of resources in their environment, even if that's not true. Again, I don't really know if that's the reason. There's another field of study called life history theory, which we'll probably cover in future videos, but basically certain populations, they prioritize number of offspring over quality of offspring, and so they start having sex early in their life. They have sex with a lot of different partners. They're basically trying to produce as many genetically diverse offspring as they can with the hopes that at least one of them will survive. So typically that mating strategy evolves in the case of a stressful environment in which there's unpredictability about the future and the environment is dynamic. Okay, they're trying to basically throw everything at the wall biologically and see what sticks. That's in contrast to slow life history strategies, which are basically people who their first sexual intercourse is later on in life. They go through puberty later on in life. They find one partner. They're monogamous. They marry that partner. They have 1 or 2 or 3 children, but they invest very heavily in those children. Okay, and so they're prioritizing quality over quantity. And that's typically common in safer environments where there's a lot of predictability about the future. Okay. Again, we might talk more about that in a future video, but that's one potential explanation for why Africans have this particular reproductive strategy. They're fast life history strategists. All right. So skipping ahead here, they talk about like the conditions under which monogamy versus polygamy would evolve. So they say high male parental investment will not evolve or be expressed except where benefits to males outweigh costs in terms of foregoing mating opportunities. So in other words, usually a male can reproduce more if he's polygamous, if he just has a bunch of partners. But there are certain circumstances where the benefits of staying with one partner outweighs those other mating opportunities. So for example, in environmental context where the father is necessary to help raise the child, and without his fatherhood, the child will not succeed, then it becomes necessary for the father to stay with the wife, and therefore monogamy develops. Okay, but they say that monogamy is rare in mammals because the males typically have more to gain by being promiscuous. Okay, they say here, again, they're referencing other species now to try to gain insight to when monogamy is advantageous versus polygamy. They say some bird populations will change from predominantly monogamous mating under a stable and restricted resource setting to polygynous mating when resources become abundant. So polygynous, that means one male has many female partners. Okay, so what they're saying here is there's sort of two situations. When resources are extremely abundant, then polygamy is favored. The reason for that is because under those circumstances, a mother can get all the resources she needs without the help of a father. So fatherhood is sort of unnecessary. It's redundant. The child doesn't need a dad to provide resources because the mom can get all the resources she needs. And she doesn't really talk about this here, but on the other side, you have situations or environments where resources are extremely not abundant. And in those circumstances, you have polygamy develop because, again, it's a stressful environment with high mortality, high unpredictability. So from the male's perspective, his best bet is just to have as many children with as many different women as possible, and that increases the likelihood that at least one of his children will survive the stressful environment. Only in the middle of environmental stability do you get monogamy. Okay, when resources are, relatively abundant, but not so abundant that the man isn't necessary. Under those circumstances, monogamy is favored. So I think one of the reasons we're seeing promiscuity rise in our culture is because women don't really need men anymore. If they're a single mother, they can collect a lot of resources from like government programs. And we're sort of in the decadence phase of our civilization where there's so many resources available that, again, you don't really need a husband around. And so I think that's one of the reasons that our society is so promiscuous right now. All right, they say here, polygyny, again, that's one male having multiple females, is associated with reduced male parental care in comparison with monogamy. So that's kind of obvious. If a man is having children with a bunch of different women, obviously he's not going to have as much time to devote to each individual child in terms of caring for it. Okay, whereas if a male is monogamous, then all of his effort can be devoted to those children. So again, from a child care perspective, monogamy is much more advantageous compared to polygamy. So we should be unhappy about the increasing polygamy in our society. It's going to produce lower quality offspring. All right, we kind of already talked about most of this. We're going to skip ahead. Again, they say that Africa has a very high prevalence of polygynous marriages. And in terms of why that's the case, they say the persistence of polygyny among rural people can be explained in part by the female farming system, common throughout much of Africa. So much of rural African subsistence is based on the work of women in their gardens. Men make only modest contributions. So here we have an interesting situation in which in Africa, males don't actually contribute that much in terms of labor for the household. It's mostly the women. Women are the ones doing the subsistence farming. They're the ones out in the field planting and harvesting crops. Okay, the men are not making that many contributions. They say a man who wishes to add another wife is under few constraints, since women in effect pay their own way. They produce food and they rear their children. The man doesn't have to do anything for the family. So therefore, a woman is not a cost to him. So he can just get another woman whenever he needs to. Whereas in a monogamous society, the man is providing for the woman. He can't just take on another woman because that's double the providing, which is twice as much work. Okay, if a man doesn't have to work for his family, as is the case in Africa, polygyny can thrive. He can get other wives to no cost to him. All right, they say the importance of male labor to support the households is reduced. In former times, before colonially imposed peace, the male role in defense was important. But since central governments have been present, men who remain in rural villages spend their time in leisure, in management of household labor, or in local political affairs. So in other words, you're wondering what are the men doing all day? Well, before colonialism, it used to be the case that they would be fighting basically in tribal wars to protect their tribe and to protect their land. So they were protectors. But now, since colonialism imposed peace throughout the continent, and since in some areas there are stable governments, there's no longer that tribal conflict as much. And so therefore, men don't have that role anymore. And they basically never picked up a new role. They basically, as I say here, spend all their time in leisure. The work of feeding people remains with women, they say. Okay, they continue on with that. They say women and children are largely self-supporting. Many efforts have been made to induce African men to increase their agricultural labor, but apparently there hasn't been a lot of success with that. Okay, so they say basically the only successful ventures they've had in this is the introduction of cash crops and the development of markets. So men are more willing to work in raising cash crops than traditional subsistence crops. And then they say women continue to do the subsistence farming, for which cash conversion is less possible, and they work even harder since the men are busy with cash crops and have even less time to help out with family gardens at clearing and harvest time. And then they say here, characteristically, men do not return their earnings from cash crops to the household economy. The money is held separately and spent by men on their own projects. So even when the men do work, they take the money that they earn and they basically keep it for themselves. They don't provide for their family. They say separate bookkeeping by husband and wife is the norm throughout much of Africa. Another thing, they say, women realize that one result of their own gardening skill and domestic management may be that the husband can siphon off surpluses and channel them into bride wealth payments for an additional wife. So in other words, the women are out in the fields harvesting crops, and if they produce enough excess crops, the men will take that, sell it, and use the money to buy a second wife. Okay, so just as a side note, I think if you had feminists read this, they might have a little bit more appreciation for the West. So for whatever reason, women in Western society have gotten it into their heads that they have it like really bad in our society. They're under the impression that they're oppressed, that they're mistreated. Well, I think they need to look at some of the other cultures around the world. It's also funny that they're the ones pushing for mass immigration of the third world into the first world, but the third world does not treat their women well. And this is just one example. The men in Africa are basically using their women as slave labor to buy more women. Okay? So I don't think a feminist would like to live in that context. Say here, urban women cannot farm, but they find income-producing work as traders, clerks, property managers, prostitutes, and domestics. So even outside of a rural setting where farming is the main thing, even if you go into the cities or the towns, they say women are the ones finding the work. It appears that women realize they cannot expect full support from their mates, and their own values lead them to work for the economic rewards, the autonomy, and the self-esteem they derive from supporting themselves and their children. So African women are basically saying, well, we can't rely on African men to support us and our children, so we just have to work ourselves. And I think that's something that they have brought with them to America and to other white nations. African men are notoriously bad at providing for their children. They have the child and then they leave. Okay. They say this pattern of mating, parenting, and kinship utilization and sexual division of labor is extremely robust and widespread and shows few signs of changing under the influence of modernization. So even though like Africa is modernizing in some areas, they still do this mating strategy where they have a lot of kids and they don't invest heavily in them. They pawn them off to other people in their environment. They say this strategy is rooted, it has its roots in an earlier pre-colonial period. So that's critical. So I've heard it said before that the reason there's polygamy throughout Africa is because, you know, basically when colonialism happened and when the slave trade happened, African males were taken out of the continent so disproportionately that it left an excess of females and, you know, not very many males. So therefore, each male had to take on multiple females. But it's important because she's discussing here how even pre-colonial periods saw hypergamy in Africa. Okay, they say in this pre-colonial context, the contribution as husbands and fathers was not essential to the maintenance of women and children. Under such circumstances, male reproductive effort was not channeled into parenting, but into mating. Okay, so now they talk more about who exactly is taking care of these children, because remember, it's not the women, it's not the fathers. They say usually the parents foster their children off to kin who are not in their reproductive years. So this might be pre-reproductives, like other children, or older individuals who are post-reproductive, like grandparents. Okay. And the reason, again, that they do this is this opens the way for both men and women to emphasize mating effort and raise fertility, and to reduce the time and energy devoted to parenting. So if you pawn your kids off on someone else and have them raise them, that opens up more time for you to just breed. So they give a little bit more details as to the living arrangement of these families. They say, in the typical polygynous compound, the husband and father has a separate hut in which he sleeps alone or with adolescent sons. His wives send food to the husband's hut each evening, where he eats with male relatives and guests. The emotional distance kept by African husbands is in fact prescribed by custom and justified on the grounds that in order to perform impartially vis-a-vis multiple wives and sets of offspring, the polygynist must maintain an authoritative and aloof distance from close association with any particular wife or child. Otherwise, jealousy would disrupt the household functioning. So in other words, the wives basically just bring him food in his own separate hut, and he's not really emotionally connected to any of these wives. The reason for that is because if he shows emotional affection toward one, it's going to make the others jealous. So part of polygamy is low emotional attachment to your partner. Okay, again, that's not good for your family structure. We know from many studies in Western cultures that, emotional distance and like poor marital quality is bad for the children. So again, these children are not being raised well, and that's one of the reasons that Africa is such a dysfunctional continent. It's all related to their mating structure. And again, they're bringing that mating structure into our society, and it's seeping out into our culture. So for example, the white out of wedlock birth rate. In the 1960s, I think it was at like 2% of white children were born out of wedlock. Now it's almost a quarter of white children are born out of wedlock. Okay, so this cultural admixture between us and all these third world cultures that we're importing, it's destroying our culture. This is not good for our society. And therefore we need to stop immigration, and therefore we need to deport all these people. They don't belong here. They're making things worse. Okay, they do say that in cases where like they have domestic animals, that's mostly maintained by the men. So this is like one of the things the men actually do. Now they say, she asks, do men pursue greater male parental investment here? So if they have like a herd of animals, do they invest more in their children since they're working? She says basically no. They're still not laboring for their wives and children. They're laboring for themselves. And regarding like why men are in charge of maintaining the herds, they say the usual pattern is for young unmarried men to move their herds. The same group is responsible for defending the herds from attack by competitive cattle-keeping people and for launching offensive raids. So the reason you need men for this job is because basically other people are trying to steal your animals, and you're trying to steal other people's animals. Okay, it's a dysfunctional free-for-all, and I think they've brought that mentality into our society too. The idea that everyone's just trying to take whatever they can from other people. All right, so now they give a little bit of a timeline for like when it is that women foster off their children to others. They say, like all female mammals, their initial investment, like gestation, childbirth, and lactation is high. However, the typical African pattern is to terminate intense care of the child early, by Western standards, in the child's life. Once a child is a year or so old, the mother enlists the help of various surrogate caretakers for her children. By the time the caretaker's infant is a toddler, the mother has trained both of them not to solicit her for help or attention. So she basically fosters her child off and is very uninvolved after that. Children learn to look to other children for satisfaction of basic needs during the day. Again, this is not going to produce a high quality society if children are raising the children. A consequence of the delegated care, early weaning, and supplemental feeding is that demand on the mother's milk supply is reduced. So she basically pawns the child off. That means the child's not breastfeeding anymore, which means the drain on her milk supply is reduced, which basically causes ovulation to occur more quickly. So this is also a strategy to enable the mother to biologically reset and be ready for the next child. So large numbers of birth per woman at relatively short birth intervals is the result. They say that this practice of fostering children, it's well described for West Africa among many different ethnic groups with differing levels of modernization and urbanization, but it also occurs in other parts of the continent. Okay? So it doesn't matter how modern they are, how urban they are, and to an extent, even geographically where they are in Africa, this is common throughout sub-Saharan Africa for the mothers to basically pawn their children off onto other people. All right. And when they get old, then other people pawn their children off onto her. It says, as a woman enters her post-reproductive years, she is less and less likely to have a man who is making a regular financial contribution to her support. Though she may remain technically married, her husband is likely to be living elsewhere with a younger woman to whom he may or may not be legally married. In Africa, it's the norm for the man to basically just abandon his wife or one of his wives in favor of some younger woman later on in life. Okay, so we're going to skip down quite a bit. One more interesting point from this paper where they suggest that Africans are basically carrying this reproductive strategy with them to the other countries they go to. She says, a literature on West African couples in London offers suggestive findings. Young couples who migrate to England for post-secondary education often bring some or all of their children with them. In the new urban setting, with high costs and high demands on their time as a result of schooling or jobs or both, the parents elect to foster their children to European families in the larger metropolitan region. The African parents fall back on indigenous institution of child fostering. So in other words, they come to the West, and this is probably like the smartest members of African society. So that you could think of these as probably the highest quality Africans coming into London, but they still just pawn their children off, in this case, onto Europeans. They go on to explain this. They say the foster parents interpret the infrequent visiting of their wards, real parents, as signs of parental neglect and become strongly attached to the foster children. So in other words, these Africans are coming here, they're pawning their children off onto white people. The white people recognize that the African parents basically never visit the child. And so the foster parents basically take this as a sign of child neglect. So by our parenting standards, which are obviously much, much higher, these parents are basically neglecting their children. And by the way, this is just like an example. It kind of encapsulates what's happening in the West more broadly. The third world, they're highly dysfunctional. They don't care about their children. They come here and they basically have us take care of them for them. And we're all too happy to do it because we're excessively compassionate. So this is one of the reasons that white society is dying. It's being replaced by the third world because we recognize that they're not doing their job of raising their children. And us in our good nature are trying to raise their children for them. It's a huge mistake. Okay. And that's one of the reasons our society is dying. All right. So that's it for the paper. Again, the main reason this paper matters is because we're bringing a lot of these people who have this reproductive strategy into our society. And we don't want that. Okay. We don't want to live in a society that's hyper promiscuous because that's, again, it ruins trust. It spreads disease. It's not a good societal strategy. We don't want a strategy where children are not given proper care because, everything depends on the quality of the people in a society. And if they're not raised well, they're going to be dysfunctional people. So ultimately, if we're serious about having a high quality society and civilization, we need to be preventing people like this from coming here, and we need to be sending the people like this who are here back. Okay? We're not compatible with them. So we'll talk more about like life history theory and some of the other aspects of reproductive strategy in future videos. Thank you for listening.